So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to the conversation on the Tule Lake Stockade Diary by Tatsuo Ryusei Inouye. My name is Stephanie Maeda, and I'm the program manager at Gardena Valley JCI. Before we begin, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to all of you for your support, and also to Manzanar Committee and Nancy Oda for organizing today's events. We hope everyone here today walks away with not just a greater understanding of this time in our history, but also with a stronger understanding of why we must continue to educate all people about the incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. So thank you all once again for joining us today. I'd now like to introduce today's moderator, Bruce Embry, to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. The Manzanar Committee is very pleased to join with the Gardena Valley JCI to host today's discussion on such an important book. And we're very excited about the publication of the Tule Lake Stockade Diary. And I believe that once you read it, you will see why. This is the diary of a most thoughtful, moral, and disciplined judo master, which holds lessons for us all as we continue to struggle for a deeper understanding of camp and its impact on our community. Mr. Inouye was Kibe, meaning he was born in the United States and educated in Japan. He was many things: a father, a prisoner, a teacher, and community leader. And lucky for us, he was a diligent chronicler as well. I think it's important for us to remember that the Issei and the Kibe were systematically deprived of their voice and role in the community, beginning in the early days of World War II, first by the FBI, then the military, the WRA, and to be honest, by some within our own community. To have a firsthand account of life from behind barbed wire from a Kibe inmate is simply precious. The grace and strength Mr. Inouye demonstrated throughout his incarceration in the stockade reminded me of another Kibe leader, Harry Ueno. Harry Ueno was the leader of the Mess Hall Workers Union at Manzanar, and like Mr. Inouye, harbored a deep compassion for his community and a burning desire to put an end to the despicable treatment the inmates were subjected to. And like Mr. Inouye, Harry found himself at Tule Lake for speaking out and resisting the racist, oppressive treatment of our families in camp. In fact, after Harry led or was the principal protagonist in what has become known as the Manzanar Revolt, he was sent to Tule Lake, along with almost 2,200 other inmates from Manzanar, following the so-called loyalty questionnaire. While reading Mr. Inouye's diary, what struck me was that he was a fierce social critic and a most astute observer of his fellow prisoners, as well as the guards and FBI agents sent to interrogate him. His piercing and oftentimes damning narrative about what he called the atrocities being committed against the Tuleans elicited the full range of emotions from me. Anger and disgust, obviously, but surprisingly, laughter and amusement too. Clearly, his training as a judo sensei helped carry him through, though I suspect his faith in humanity was a factor as well. In one of his many interrogations, he told one FBI interrogator, quote, "I want to believe goodness exists in this country. I want to believe that there are people with good judgment who believe in justice and democratic principles." That's quite a statement, in my opinion, from a man separated from his family, incarcerated without charges, and subjected to inhumane conditions in a stockade within a prison camp. We continue to see his indomitable spirit in his daughter, Kyoko Nancy Oda, who toiled so many years to get her father's diary published, all the time, all the while working tirelessly to preserve the memory of camp so future generations can learn from what our community endured. I wanted to share one pearl of wisdom she shared recently. While being interviewed by Discover Nikkei about what she learned from her father's diary, Nancy Kyoko said, "I better understand the frailty of democracy and its ideals. We have a lot of work to do still." Truer words have not been spoken. With that, I'd like to introduce today's panel. We have four distinguished activists joining us today. First, we have Martha Nakagawa, a a descendant of a Tule Lake incarcerated. Nancy Kyoko Oda, obviously, was born on May 20th, 1945 in the Tule Lake Segregation Camp, and she began to transcribe her father's diary 50 years ago. She is a former elementary school principal, Tuna Canyon Detention Station president, and she is reclaiming her birth name, Kyoko. Richard Murakami was 10 years old when the war broke out. His family lived in Lakewood, California, and were moved from Tule Lake to Jerome and finally to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. He's been a volunteer at JANM for more than 26 years and documenting the museum's history. He has participated in the ABC USD Day of Remembrance for many years. Jason Fujii is a second-level teacher whose grandmother was incarcerated at the Tule Lake Segregation Camp. He is a member of the Manzanar Committee and quite effective leader of Manzanar After Dark, which engages college students in Japanese American history. He has also been the impact speaker for the ABC USD Day of Remembrance. With that, I'd like to welcome everyone and introduce Martha Nakagawa as our first speaker.
Thank you, Bruce. I was introduced to Mr. Inouye's diary while working at UCLA's Asian American Studies Center and helped to edit the English translation. And I would like to thank Professor David Yu, who at the time was head of the Asian American Studies Center and was very supportive of the A.G. Suyama project, which funded the editing and getting the diary translation up on the Suyama website for the public to access. And thanks to the anonymous donor who funded the A.G. Suyama project, he was a 442nd veteran, but recognized the importance of Nisei protesters like Mr. Inouye. And thanks to Tom Wynn, who wrote the computer code to get Mr. Inouye's diary up on the website, and to Professor Karen Umemoto, the current chair of the Asian American Studies Center, who has been very supportive of continuing the Suyama project, and to Professor Masumi Izumi of Doshisha University, who did the translation. And of course, thanks to Mr. Inouye's daughter, late Masako Ernie Jane Inouye Nishi, who worked to get this diary out to the public. Now, I was asked to give a brief history of Tule Lake, but let me first touch upon how this country has operated since it was created by white colonists. When the US Constitution was written, it did not grant rights to enslaved people or to indigenous people whom the white colonists were trying to kill off. The US Constitution was written for the benefit of white male property owners. It took a bloody civil war before the 14th Amendment was added to grant birthright citizenship to African Americans born on this continent to enslaved people. But indigenous people would not be granted US citizenship until 1924. Since the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, Americans sought other sources of cheap labor, but detested the very immigrants who were that source of cheap labor. So when it came to Japanese Americans, the US government passed laws barring the Issei immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. This was followed by alien land laws to prevent these immigrants from putting down roots in this country. When World War II broke out, the federal government did what it always did against people it found undesirable. It passed arbitrary laws. The government ultimately decided to lock up all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, regardless of citizenship status, because they were getting a lot of pressure from racist groups such as the Native Sons of the Golden West. None of this had anything to do with national security. General DeWitt epitomized the thinking of the government at the time when he said, quote, "A Jap is a Jap," end of quote. But when the government started getting criticism from other countries, particularly from Japan, for locking up US citizens, the government realized this didn't look good. They also realized they didn't want to keep Japanese Americans locked up too long, since it would be a burden on taxpayers. But they needed a way to separate those who would go along with government policy and those who would question it and cause trouble. This is how they came up with the controversial loyalty questionnaire. So the War Relocation Authority, which oversaw Japanese American camps, and the War Department came up with this poorly worded loyalty questionnaire to determine, number one, which Japanese American men could be drafted into the Army. Number two, which Japanese Americans could be released to non-West Coast states if they had a sponsor. And number three, which Japanese Americans should be segregated because they were not complying with government mandates. So with this so-called loyalty questionnaire, what the government was doing is conflating the meaning of cooperation with loyalty. Now, Tule Lake started out as one of 10 War Relocation Authority camps, but the reason it was chosen to become a maximum security segregation center had more to do with the camp director's bad managerial style rather than any defect on the inmates' part. For example, the Tuleans were asking the administration for answers to basic questions like, what is the purpose of the loyalty questionnaire? What is it going to be used for? The administration, rather than take the democratic route by holding series of meetings to explain things, took the totalitarian approach and announced through the camp newspaper that those who interfered with registration would be fined up to $10,000 and or be imprisoned up to 20 years. Then the administration followed up on making an example of Block 42 men who refused to register by arresting them in front of everyone. Unbeknownst to the Tuleans, the administration had no legal authority to arrest the Block 42 men, and refusing to answer the questionnaire did not carry a fine or jail term. But the Tuleans didn't know the government was lying. The administration was trying to terrorize the inmates into registering for the questionnaire. But it had the opposite effect of making the inmates more defiant, especially after seeing friends or loved ones from Block 42 being taken away. This is why Tule Lake has such a large number of inmates refusing to answer the loyalty questionnaire. It had nothing to do with loyalty or disloyalty. But the government labeled anyone who refused to answer or who wrote in a conditional clause or gave other unsatisfactory answers on the loyalty questionnaire as disloyal people. After Tule Lake became a segregation camp, thousands of inmates from other WRA camps were shipped to Tule Lake in the fall of 1943. Not surprisingly, Tule Lake became overcrowded and inmates faced food shortages and unsanitary living conditions. So the government stopped shipping inmates to Tule Lake after it reached a peak population of 18,700. And this was a camp that was built only for 15,000 people. Now, it was into this situation that Mr. Inouye and his family were placed into from the Colorado River WRA camp, more commonly referred to as Poston. To guard these new inmates, the military police was increased to 1,000 men, and the Army engineer surrounded the camp with an 8-foot wire fence, which was topped off with a barbed wire sloping inward. The overcrowding and tense relationship between the inmates and the administration led to a lot of unrest and protests. And at one point, the Army rolled into Tule Lake with tanks in November 43 and declared martial law. The camp did not revert to civilian control until January 44. Now, it was during this time that Kyoko's father had been picked up and thrown into the Stockade, a prison within the Tule Lake prison camp. Now that the government had all these alleged non-compliant Nikkei segregated in Tule Lake and the more troublesome ones in the Stockade, the government had to figure out what to do with them. Pressure from anti-Japanese elected officials and from racist groups resulted in, what else? The passage of another law. Public Law 405 passed in July 44 and allowed U.S. citizens to renounce their citizenship in time of war. Passed specifically to deal with the Tuleans. Once the government could get these Japanese Americans to renounce their citizenship, they could be declared as enemy aliens and be legally deported. It has since been documented that renunciation had little to do with disloyalty. Some of the reasons Tuleans renounced included renouncing out of anger for being treated unconstitutionally, renouncing because they saw no future for themselves in the U.S., renouncing because they were misled to believe that this would keep the family unit together, and renouncing because they were misled to believe that they could wait out the war in Tule Lake and then go back to their West Coast homes. Civil rights attorney Wayne Collins, who spent 23 years trying to restore U.S. citizenship to Japanese Americans, described Tule Lake at the time as an insane asylum due to the chaos and misinformation being tossed around. In fact, there were sociologists doing experiments by starting a rumor at one end of the camp to see how this rumor mutated. Anecdotally, there is reason to believe that the government may have planted agent provocateurs to pressure Japanese Americans to renounce their U.S. citizenship because in my 2 decades of attending Tule Lake pilgrimages, there have been several former Tuleans who shared stories of being pressured by other Japanese Americans to renounce, but would later find out that the person who pressured them had never renounced themselves or been transferred to another camp. The idea of Asian provocateurs is not too far-fetched. You have to remember the government wanted to deport as many Japanese Americans as they could, and J. Edgar Hoover, who had just formed the FBI in 1935, was obsessed with subversive organizations. Hoover is famous for his counterintelligence program that ran from 56 to 71, which were a series of covert and illegal missions where the Bureau infiltrated and discredited American organizations such as anti-Vietnam War protesters, feminist groups, civil rights groups, environmentalists, and animal rights groups. So the question is, could Hoover have gotten his feet wet by practicing these tactics on Japanese Americans in Tule Lake? It's possible. It is within this context that Mr. Inouye's diary should be read. What the Japanese American protesters, such as Mr. Inouye and other Tuleans, the draft resistors, and the military resistors did was challenge the white male power structure to go beyond the antiquated notion that, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end of quote, belonged only to white male property owners, and to expand that concept to embrace people of color. That, however, didn't happen until the 1960s when the African American community rose up and forced us all to re-examine the defects of the Constitution. And today, we need to continue breathing new life into the Constitution so that it will be truly protective of the rights of all. Thank you. And I give it back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Martha. I'm glad we unfroze you. That was really good. Thanks so much. Next, we'd like to hear from the mover and shaker behind all of this, Kyoko Oda.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Bruce and Martha. Martha actually had a huge role in the Tsuyama online edition of this diary. You know, she went with us to meetings and spent hours and hours with her mom, who also was participated in helping me translate. So, Martha, thank you so much. This is a small token of my appreciation, but I did not want to overlook that. You are very precious to us. I would like to thank the Gardena Japanese Cultural Institute, the Manzanar Committee, and for all of their support for this day today. The Tule Lake Stockade Diary is about a complicated time when Japanese and Japanese Americans were forced to answer the loyalty questions issued by the US government. 12,000 men, women, and children were shipped from 9 other concentration camps to Tule Lake, making the population 18,789, the largest of the 10 camps. They say people who said yes, yes, wanted to keep the family together, mainly to avoid another troublesome move. Indeed, Tule Lake was for some people who wanted to go back to Japan. My father, Tatsuo, responded to the questionnaire, question 27, with no, because his brothers were still in Japan and he would not think of fighting them, and neutral to 28. My maternal grandparents, the Sugimotos, begged him to stay in Poston, but it was against his principles as a Kibe Nisei, a person born in the United States and educated in Japan. He had to stand up for what he believed in, no matter how difficult. When he arrived in Tule Lake in October, he began to unpack the family and wanted to begin judo practice. He was the oldest 4th degree black belt, making him the head teacher. He was a leader of the soon-to-be organized Daiichi Judo Dojo. Tule Lake was poorly managed, so it was ripe for discontent. This would be easily be a topic, but I want to keep this brief. There was a lot of tension as the tanks rolled down the fire breaks after a farm strike. By November 13th, Raymond Best created a military state. My father had attended a negotiation meeting and had signed in. As a result, he was arrested in front of my mother and 2 sisters by 2 armed guards or more. At first, the men were confined in tents, then moved to barracks. Each day, Tatsuo wrote about what he ate, what he saw, and what he thought. He kept count of the growing population that began with 9 people. The men had rotated jobs such as making rice, but it took all day because they did not have enough pans, and carrying buckets of coal and taking care of sanitation. It was a truly scary time when soldiers shot bullets to make young men move faster while carrying the coal. Men and boys were beaten with 2x4s or shoved with bayonets. There were 1,000 troops brought in to guard the camp, and especially the 215 men in the stockade. He wrote, "I cannot fight at age 33, but I can fight with this pen." Thus, Tatsuo's voice captured the moment in this diary in real time forever. On November 19th, Tatsuo was interviewed by an FBI agent who was trying to make Inouye say why he was arrested. He was outraged by the treatment they were receiving that was inhumane. The FBI questions were to take him off balance, much like Randori, in trying to trip him into self-incrimination. But Inouye was a judo expert with a strong body and even stronger mind. The interviews occurred several times. He wrote, "I have no other means to help people but to teach judo. Teaching judo prepares the youth who plan to go to Japan, while at the same time keeping the peace in camp. During these cold months, conditions in the stockade led to a full-blown flu outbreak, and many of the men were sick. I cannot describe how cold it was when the last embers flickered out in the little stove. There were bayonets staring at us when we went to the bathroom. There were machine guns in the mess hall. Why are they scared of us? My mother sent vitamins before my father had even requested it. He wrote that she kept him strong by taking care of him and their 2 small children, ages 4 and 7. By December, there was a 3rd, then 4th, and even 5th guard tower to guard the 6 barracks. If that wasn't enough, a 3rd fence surrounded them to keep them from escaping. Some men gambled or played cards to pass the time, but Tatsuo read a book called Saikontan to quiet his mind. He tried to divide the food to feed the hungry men, but 1 tablespoon of rice was not enough for anyone. Later, he had only 1 teaspoon of rice to share. On another day, he was supposed to serve rotten mackerel for dinner. "We are Japanese. We know fish." The prisoners refused to eat it even though they were hungry, and the cruel soldiers brought it back the 2nd day. The WRA thought that the underground was operated by the youths from Hawaii, then Topaz, then Jerome, and then they finally turned their attention to the judoka. By dinner time on December 31st, the hunger strike began. It was written, "We pledge our loyalty to Japan as we have lived under pressure during the war in the United States. We were segregated and sent to Tule Lake. Then we were illegally thrown in the stockade. Today is the 19th year of Showa, the first day of the month. We meditated upon those feelings on this day." So, despite the cold weather, brutality, and starvation, the men voted to protest until all were released. It was a non-violent resistance to bring attention to the poor food, poor medical care, and inhumane treatment by the U.S. government, and wrongful detention in the stockade. Inouye painted a picture for those not yet born to imagine what happened in America's cruelest concentration camp. He went through many emotions candidly and gave me this diary to share with the world, and that is why. Let me breathe. It's very painful for me to visualize how he was treated during the 3 months and 1 day. But he never lost faith in the United States. He said, "They will not let us die." Towards the end of the diary, he wrote, "I got on my knees and prayed fervently. for the camp to recover in peace. I prayed for the day when the administration would discard their prejudices. I prayed that the camp would become a safe place where the elderly, the children, and women could live safely and peacefully. Tuleans have been called disloyal. They've been misunderstood, in many cases reviled by our own community for more than 77 years. When the government loyalty question divided us, it is time to learn from our history and honor our ancestors, the Issei and Kibe, for their courage and resistance during a complex time. When I was born, my father wrote, "Although the world is in chaos and the future is unknown, she will bring people and the family together in harmony. I give this baby the name Kyoko. To honor the 120,000 incarcerated and their families, I sign each book with the words, 'In Unity.' Thank you for the privilege of bringing you my father's story in the Tule Lake Stockade Diary today."
Thank you, Nancy. That was very, very powerful. Incredible. I know Martha and Kyoko have raised really important points, and it's generating a whole lot of questions. Can you please put your questions in the Q&A? If you look down below on your Zoom, you'll see that little bar there. There's a Q&A section. Please put your questions there, and we'll be able to get to them and answer them. So now, wow, that was very, very moving. Now we'd like to hear from Richard.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to thank the Manzanar Committee for asking me to participate today. Hi, my name is Richard Murakami. I was 10 years old when the U.S. government incarcerated our family of 7 in a U.S. concentration camp for 3.5 years during World War II. All 7 of us were United States citizens. Because of my response to the so-called loyalty questionnaire administered by the government, we were one of the few families who were in 3 camps, Tule Lake, Jerome, and Hard Mountain. I trust that you will not mind if I tell you my story by referring to an article written by the MC of an event held to discuss the trauma experienced by Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. The MC was Soji Kashiwagi, who I think most of you know. His article was titled, "I Had Fun in Camp." And to quote his article, "For many of the young Japanese Americans held behind barbed wire fences in America's concentration camps during World War II, this is what they'll say when they're asked about their camp experience. In many ways, it is true. Many did have fun. They ran around with their friends. They played baseball, basketball. They even danced the nights away at high school dances in the rec hall. But oftentimes, I had fun in camp is said to deflect attention away from another kind of truth, or darker truth, one that most survivors do not want to talk about. So when Richard Murakami, an older sensei who has been a docent at the Japanese American National Museum for over 20 years, said, I had fun in camp during our growing up sensei post-reading discussion, I thought he was going to talk about all the fun times he had in camp and how camp wasn't so bad for a 10-year-old who was incarcerated with his family in Tule Lake. But then he surprised me. In the context of our discussion with Dr. Satsuka Ina about camp trauma and its effects on the Nisei and subsequent generations, Richard said, I had fun in camp because my Nisei parents and Issei friends made sure I had fun in camp. they made life as normal as possible for us kids and saw to it that we were happy and had fun. To quote Soji, this was the first time I had heard a survivor acknowledge that fun in camp just didn't happen. It was his parents and friends who were determined to make it happen, despite the terrible circumstances and conditions they were living in. He continued, our parents did not say, woe is us, or complain about what was happening to us. I played with my friends and had a good time. I learned to play basketball, football, and softball. But much later, I learned that my mother has suffered a tough life in camp. When my brother Dan heard that I was going to the 2016 Tule Lake pilgrimage, he told me what happened when he and my mother visited the Tule Lake. They decided to visit Tule Lake on their way back from visiting friends in Oregon. My brother told me that when we reached Tule Lake, my mother started to cry, and she would not stop crying until they left the campsite. So then, 71 years later, after our camp experience, was the first time I learned that my mother had a tough life, unhappy life while we were incarcerated. She never showed it after camp. In our family, we never talked about camp after we were released. And when my father passed away in 1945, I don't ever remember him ever mentioning camp one time after we came out. And as to quote Sojina in his article, he says, these are the stories we need to hear, I said to Richard. We need to hear the truth behind the truth. Thank you for sharing your truth. Now, that was the end of the article. Now, I'm wearing a shirt. It says Gaman. I'm wearing this shirt in honor of my parents. And for those of you that, most of you know what Gaman is, but for those of you who don't know what Gaman means, it means enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. The idea is often translated as perseverance or patience. I did not have to Gaman. My parents did. So that's why I wore this in honor of them. I thank you for attending this conference today and for listening to my story.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your story. And thank you for sharing your truth. That was really, really wonderful. Now we get to hear from Jason.
Thank you, Bruce. And then also thank you, Kyoko, for having me and everyone else on the panel. I feel like I am not qualified to be on the same panel as everyone here, but thank you for giving me the opportunity. I do want to start off with a little bit about myself because my grandfather was incarcerated at Amachi and my grandmother was at Tule Lake. And growing up, I feel like it's kind of the story that you will hear a lot with my Yonsei generation or fourth generation is that I never had that first initial thought about what I want to learn more about my grandparents' history or knowing more than what's in the history books at school. And it wasn't until about middle school, high school, when I realized that there wasn't a lot mentioned about my history and curious why that is, because I knew of it happening, but in a book, it's only a couple paragraphs long. And that led me into really trying to delve more into my own past and figuring out who I am and the generations before me and how it shaped me. Fast forward that to in college when I became a part of the Nikkei Student Union Cal State Long Beach, and got involved with the Manzanar Committee. And it helped me realize more of my own identity. And when I finally joined the Manzanar Committee and became part of Manzanar at Dusk, it showed me a side that I can take what little I know and share those stories with the community. And which finally led me to how I met Kyoko. Again, I was very lucky to meet her at a Katari pilgrimage or program that we've done with the college students. And just the amount of drive that she has really shows the importance of learning about your history. And that's where my realization about my family and more information came to be, is that during our first Katari pilgrimage or program, I was able to submit camp rosters or camp family information to figure out where my grandparents were incarcerated and the little bit of the history behind it. And that is where, from a park ranger at Manzanar, I found out that my grandmother's older brother and sister they renunciated their citizenship at that time. And for me, it was an eye-opener because that was a part of my family history I didn't know. That my grandparents lived up in Stockton, so the communication when I was growing up wasn't as easy. And I also felt like I blamed myself for not trying to reach out, not realizing the importance of learning about the history before it was too late. And the part that I think hurt the most wasn't the fact that I didn't know, it was more the fact that I happened to have found out through an outside source. And it hurt, but it's not like I blamed anyone for it. It was just that realization of how one event, one part in history can really affect and cause a ripple effect through generations, as far as just knowing your family and their history. I unfortunately are at a time where I don't get that opportunity to learn as much, because when I did find out, my grandmother has already passed. But now I keep that as a lesson that I learned, and to hope to educate others that it is never too late to start asking your family about their history and the importance of that. And that's where I think Kyoko's book comes into place, is that this is a vital part of history. This is living proof, in a book about the life within the Tule Lake Stockade. And just going through it, you could feel the passion that her father had, and just the fact that his letters and what he wrote, it wasn't about the hardships, or it wasn't so focused on that, but the parts that I really focused on was that he still reached out saying to the daughters, saying, make sure you go to sleep, make sure you take care of everyone. So it really shows that even through everything that he might be going through, and the worry and the hardships, that it's always family first, and how important that really is to him, and how much he wants to make sure that, even though how I interpret is that he might not be physically there with the family, that he is still there spiritually, and that he will get through this. And yeah. So it leads on to, again, that we have this important part of history. We are very blessed to have it. And my message to everyone, my generation and younger, or anyone really on this attending, is that to start asking those questions about where have I come from, what have they gone through. And as I do this with the ABC Unified DOR, where they're high school students, is to start with a simple question of, what was your favorite food growing up, and really delve into that with your parents or your grandparents if you're lucky enough. And that's why I think ultimately this book to me symbolizes, is that the pure importance of having that history and having it written down or recorded. Because something that I learned and my brother learned is that a lot of the time when you want to learn more, it might be too late, and having this down is the most important thing. I do want to end with, Kyoko did ask me one time, because I carry the Tule Lake banner for the Manzanar pilgrimages, why do I do that? And I said, I would be honored to carry the banner for Tule Lake or Amachi because I am representing my grandparents. I'm representing a part of history that has to be known and needs to be known and shared and cannot be forgotten. And I almost see myself as that bridge of carrying those stories over to that next generation and really educating everyone how important it is to know the not only US history, but your own history too. So thank you again for everyone for listening, and thank you again, Kyoko, for having me.
Thank you, Jason. Now, I guess you all can see why Jason is in charge of the Manzanar After Dusk for the Manzanar Committee. And just to reaffirm what he said, he is a very effective bridge, an excellent bridge between his generation and our history. So thank you, Jason. We have a few questions here that folks have asked. Please feel free to add more into the Q&A. We have a few minutes here. But the first question is directed to Kyoko, and it says, what was life with your father after the war, and what did he do in life?
Thank you so much for that question. My father came back to Lancaster, California on a train from Tule Lake with me, the baby, 5 months old, and regrouped with my grandparents who were in Poston. So the family got back together, and he went ahead to Los Angeles, to Boyle Heights, to the house that we had that was being taken care of by the Gomez family. Before the war, the Gomez family was my parents' best customers. You know, they would always come and put down, you know, today we bought milk, bread, bologna. They used to call it minced ham those days, and always paid and were very conscientious. So he asked them to take care of the house. So we did have a house to return to. So that was very, very lucky. But it took a while because they had 5 people in their family and we had 5 people in the family. And so there had to be some adjustment. So he went to the basement and thought about what he could do to earn a living. You know, the store was gone by then, you know, he lost that. And so he had 2 choices, he told me. One was to either be a grave digger at Evergreen Cemetery, which is just down the block, or be a gardener. You know, his English was very good, but he had a terrible accent, so to speak, compared to his brother. So, you know, he always was very conscious of that. So he did choose to be a gardener because he thought he would embarrass the girls, my 2 sisters and myself, by being a grave digger. But, you know, whatever he would have done, we would have been proud of him. So one of the things that I hear people say, like, you know, when I was 20, I did this. When I was 40, I did this. When I did 60, I did this. You know, these are chapters of your life. But my father was totally dedicated to judo. You know, he charged, for example, $5 a month. And $5 a month was not a moneymaker. The big idea was to bring the whole neighborhood into practice. You know, he had no prejudice towards the kids in the neighborhood. And I think that's a very important message because, you know, sometimes I do hear people pushing back still. We need to stop that. You know, we need to be one world. So anyway, my father returned to judo, and he would work all day long in his truck. And then he would stop by the grocery store, and I'd jump out and get him beer, which you can't do today because I was definitely underage. And anyway, you know, it was a different time. But anyway, he was a gardener and a judo man. And, you know, I thought what Jason said was really true. You know, I always felt safe. I was always protected. And I did have trouble in camp as a baby. And I did see the graves of a lot of babies, people who lived 1 day, 1 month, 1 year. And I could have been one of them. I'm very much aware of that. So that's what he did after the war. He continued. He did at the end become an 8th degree judo sensei. So we're very proud of that.
We have another question for you, Kyoko. Kensaku Nakayama asks, can Kyoko share a little bit about her father's life in pre-war Japan as a young kibe?
In pre-war Japan, well, my dad had this. And by the way, Kensaku Nakayama is one of my father's judo students. So I'm very excited because there are a couple of students. And just before the webcast, I did get a call from Steve Walters, who's another black belt from the dojo. So I'm very sorry we can't see you in person, but COVID is very dangerous. So thank you so much for tuning in. So in pre-war Japan, my father was born here, as you know. He was 3 years old when he returned to Japan, and his father was so proud of him because he had a child 3, 5, and 7, and they arranged for a parade in Kumamoto and Utoshi. That's Uto City. And the legend is that he cried, but he didn't cry. He told me later in life it was his middle brother that cried. So they took them off the horses, and they decided to make a beautiful poem that's in the temple in Kumamoto now. But he went to school, and he basically had flowing hair. So when the Hoshidan and when the other protesters shaved their hair off, he didn't want to do that. Plus, it was very cold. So he only cut his hair in shame when the hunger strike failed. That he felt was a statement. But he loved judo. And so before he left Japan and his beloved mother and father, he went to go see Toyama Mitsuru to ask for guidance. According to my dad, he told me that Toyama Sensei was one of the 100 most influential people in Japan of a certain era. And so he was brushed off several times. Here's this kid, 16, 17 years old. And here's this man of great stature. But eventually, Toyama-san sat down quietly, pulled out a brush, and wrote Senshin, handed it to my father. So the name of the dojo that he brought to America is called Senshin Dojo, Pure Heart. And I want to mention something because some of you may know that Toyama Sensei was accused of being one of the Black Dragon, and it may be true, but the Black Dragon Society was actually anti-military, because Japan was in this mental state where they were trying to fight everybody. And so he had a belief that that was not the path to take. So anyway, it's interesting what history teaches us or doesn't teach us, because I do know my father cut out a little newspaper article when Toyama Sensei passed away. And so I have it right behind me, actually, all these little things he kept, all the newspapers that he had in camp. So I guess in saying what he did before the war, he loved judo, he loved his family. And if you read the diary, you don't get quite the idea of what's going on. But when I went to Japan, their house and their property is so big, it's like a park. And it was very impressive to me. So in the book, he talks about, what kind of job do you have? And he says, we have money, but he didn't mean it in a bad way. It's just, that was right in the Meiji Jidai when they had the property, and things were not as they are today. So I think I hope I answered your question. Nakayama-san. We think of your father. His father was one of the black belts in the dojo.
My cousin, Carrie Kababa, asks some of what you just finished talking about. Have you been to visit your father's family in Kumamoto? So is there anything you wanted to add beyond what you just talked about?
Well, thanks to my mother and father, we're very close to our relatives. Despite the distance, what we found out is when we would see the people in Nagoya or Tokyo or Kumamoto, they haven't seen each other, but we see them because we'll take a trip and we visit all these people, and we don't sightsee, we visit family. So we have seen the family. It's time for us to go, but due to COVID, we're not going to be able to go for a while, but that's on the agenda. So I think the question was, do we go back to Japan? Yes, we do. And, it's sad because the people my age, there's only about 2 left. And the story is that when I arrived in Japan the last time, they all come running because they said, your father sent us food and clothing after the war, and we are so grateful. And so they treated me so beautifully and they, I was just so grateful. But, these are things that they don't tell you that they do. And then the relatives tell you that, because it wasn't an easy time for him either to be sending boxes of supplies to Japan. Thank you, Carrie.
Carrie helps Kyoko with the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition work as well. There's a couple more questions here about the diary. One, I'm going to try and combine them. One is from Faye, and she asks, how did you first learn about the diary? And another is from Cynthia that asks, why did it take so long to get the diary published? And what were the greatest hurdles you had to overcome? So how did you first learn about the diary, and how long it took to get published, and what were the hurdles?
Okay. I believe I first learned about the diary in probably 1968. You hear about it, but I never saw it until about 1968. And that's because I said to my father, I'm going to UCLA and I need to do a project. My teacher asked me to follow up and, bring the Tule Lake Stockade story to the class. And so it was all in Japanese. So we began to sit down at nights to translate it. And so that was the very beginning of the project. And why did it take a long time? That is it was weighing on my shoulders for so long. Life takes its course. You get married, you have children, you have a job. But I knew even on the day I retired, I said, I have to finish this diary. And why did it take so long? It's because we had to find a person like Masumi who gave so much to making this possible. Masumi was at a conference that Danum hosted in Seattle, Washington in 2013, and we met her in an elevator. If you see the first tape that Janum did of the Tule Lake Stockade Diary, you could hear her whole story, but it was kind of a miracle meeting, serendipity. You meet somebody who says, tell me what your book is about. So I had brought my mother's and father's letters. There were 33 letters. And I had put it into a little packet with a picture of my mom. She was so beautiful. And you get, just like what Jason said, they were communicating with each other. They didn't say, oh my God, it's so miserable, I'm eating rotten mackerel. Never anything to show just, how hard it was. They kept saying, oh, we're doing fine, Be sure the child has their cod liver oil, always concerned about each other. But Masumi made it possible for us to bring it all the way, which is very important part of the diary, which she resumed it from the January 1st through February 13th, 14th. So basically the part that I had initiated with my dad during the 70s was from November 13th to about January 1st. So I had an inkling of what first and second was about, but she brought it to fruition, and she's such a great translator. You know, there are translators and there are translators, and she's very high quality, and we're very blessed to meet her. And I hope she's on board listening today, because there's no way we could ever repay her for her kindness. She's come many times to the United States to discuss this with Martha and Dr. Yu and Tam at UCLA, you know. So she has made a great sacrifice to get this together. So she's the one who's typing it in Japanese, and her intention, I understand, is to publish it in Japanese.
There are a couple of comments thanking you and your father in the Q&A, and I was like, if they could put them in the chat so that other people can see them. They're comments, and I think they're really they're wonderful comments, and I think they would be nice to put them in the chat. There's a question here from Hiroyuki Taga. And it's a bit long. I'm going to read it, and I think it's a general question. I noticed Nancy Ukai had joined us today, and she's one of our community's wonderful scholars, most knowledgeable about many, many things, and maybe she may even have the answer to this question. But if someone else does, please put that in the chat. The question is, my mother and father were imprisoned at Tule. My mother was a Nisei and my father was a Kibe. My father eventually was imprisoned at federal detention at Santa Fe, New Mexico. I don't know much about it, but was wondering if my dad ended up in Santa Fe, does that mean he was probably imprisoned in the Tule Lake Stockade too? How do I find out more about this?
I could take a stab at that one.
Great.
The fact that your father, Mr. Taga, was at Santa Fe does not mean he was in the stockade. What it means is that what happened is the government started to round out the Hokoku Hoshida members at Tule Lake. Once you renounce your citizen Department of Justice camp, because you are no longer a citizen, and Santa Fe was a Department of Justice camp. So that means your father renounced and was put there. I don't know if he ended up at Crystal City or where he went after that. Most likely he was helped by Wayne Collins to get his citizenship back. So no, it does not mean he was in the stockade.
You might want to check the Tuna Canyon website to see if his name is on the honor roll, because people didn't necessarily go straight to Santa Fe. I need to know where they lived before the war, because if they were anywhere between San Diego to Santa Barbara, they could have been part of the group that went to Tuna Canyon, then eventually went to Santa Fe. So if they want to write to me a little bit more information, I might be able to assist you with our researcher. But thank you, Martha, for giving that information.
One more thing I wanted to add, I forgot about the last part, is Mr. Taga asked about finding more information. The National Archives has forms there. If you go to the Japanese American section, World War II, they do have forms that you can download and print out and send in, and to request your father's files. And because he was in a DOJ camp, I would also recommend that you try to get your father's FBI files too.
There's a couple more questions here. Ashley Watanabe asks, where's the original diary now, and what are the plans to have it preserved?
Okay, the diaries are here in my house, not in the garage. And I went through a whole process of trying to decide what to do. what are the plans for the future? Well, that's a very nicely put thing because I'm not going to last forever. This white hair is real. And so my hope if we run out of time before we make the decision that my family will take charge of it. But my dream was to have the Tule Lake Museum be a reality, and that the artifacts that we have will go to the Tule Lake Museum. But it is really in an inaccessible area on purpose. So there's a lot of points to consider if you want a lot of people to see it. But if you have any good ideas, I would appreciate them. They're in remarkably good condition. My father always kept things very nicely. He himself was like a cowboy, He wasn't a neat person, but things he valued, he kept very nicely.
I'll have to remember that. Cowboy.
Yeah, he was. Are you a cowboy, Bruce?
I plead the Fifth Amendment. Nancy Yukai asked if can Kyoko show us the diaries, or are they not immediately available? I hope that question got answered, Nancy. We have a question also from John Kaji. He says, Kyoko, were there any kotowaza or Japanese proverbs that your father shared with you and the family?
They're not Japanese proverbs. They're judo proverbs. Maximum efficiency, minimum effort. This is from Kano Sensei. Or mutual welfare and benefit, which I think of all the time, that when we do our work, we have to think of the mutual welfare and benefit, not just for my own selfish thinking. So I don't know, in terms of proverbs, I know Oya Hikari wa Nana Hikari is something I chose myself, which means your parental influence lasts forever.
That is true. This next question is actually for Jason from Nancy Takayama, I believe is a JCL governor. She says, as a Yonsei and Manzanar After Dark organizer, were there many people unaware that Tule Lake had a different tragic story for the JAs? And how will you be able to educate them to let them know that it didn't get better for them post-war?
Good question, Nancy. Thank you. Personally, for myself, I knew a little bit about Tule Lake, and obviously when I learned more. And as I presented and talked with college students and high school students, it always depended on the group that you're talking to. A lot of the college students I talked to were part of Nikkei Student Union, which is a Japanese American organization on several of the Southern California college campuses. So they've heard of Tule Lake and they've heard of the no-nos, but I think a lot of the history did, and a lot of that knowledge stopped kind of at that point, even to the point when I've talked to them about the loyalty questionnaire. They were as shocked as someone that isn't a part of the community, as far as that's what's really being asked. So as far as how to educate, I think definitely this book is a great way because it does show the hardship that was going through at this time. And I think for post-war, there's a lot of education to be done, me personally for myself, and also amongst our community too, because of, I think, how some people saw or treated the no-nos as after camp because of their choices that were made. I think these panels like this is a great way to educate, and with this power of Zoom and online, we're able to spread that message. So I think at this point, that would be probably the best, because then we have a very wide outreach. It does make me think of last year's Manzanar Dust, where we had participants or attendees from Oregon, from, I believe, New York, from Japan. So it shows that having that voice out there is, I think, the key way in telling those stories and passing them on. So thank you. Hopefully I answered your question.
Thank you, Jason. Next question is from Steve Nagano. And Steve asks, Richard and Kyoko, could you share with us your feelings when you first went to Tule Lake, knowing the experiences your parents had there?
For a long time, I did not want to go to the Tule Lake pilgrimage. And my wife wanted to go because she was in Tule Lake. And the reason why I didn't want to go is because I was only there the first year. And so I didn't go. Well, in fact, in all the camp reunions, I really didn't want to. I didn't really want to go to any. I just didn't, want to attend those things. And anyway, the first time I went, I went because my wife Masako wanted to go, so we went. But was I really happy I went? What did I expect? I didn't really expect anything. But on the way back, as soon as I got on the bus, I told Masako, we're coming back for the next one. And she said the same thing. So that was in 2014. So when we went in 2016, we got on the bus and we said, we're coming back again. So I've been to 3 of them, 14, 16, and 18. And as I explained, in 16 is when my brother told me about what my mother happened to my mother. There's one thing I didn't mention before, and I haven't told too many people this story. So we were in Tule Lake the first year. And so when the loyalty questionnaire came out, we almost went back to Japan. I had 2 brothers in Hiroshima, an older brother and a younger brother. So that's why my father wanted to go to Japan. And I always tell people, my mother was a wise one. All she said was, how are we going to eat? That stopped everything. So that's why, you say, and then my father was the oldest son, so he was the head of the family. There were 4 families that went into Tule Lake together. And so my father wanted everybody to go to the same camps together. So that's why, we went to Jerome all together and then to her mountain. But like I tell people, well, I almost ended up in Japan. And my father was a Kibe. And my father really believed in the United States. And we never really talked, but as I told a few volunteers at the museum, my father died a disillusioned man. He was disillusioned about the United States of America, the government. And I'm looking forward for the next one, which will probably be my last one. But that, as far as I understand, I just heard that the 22 one was just canceled. Am I right, Martha?
With the Omicron COVID variant going out, I believe they are not going to be having another one this coming year because
I believe it'll be a virtual. This Omicron is really raging, so people are very worried about it. We are very worried about it for Manzanar as well.
So to answer Steve's question, in the 70s, I went on the Manzanar bus with my dad and sat and begged him to let me do the diary. That's a good, 3-4 hours on the bus coming back and forth. And then we went to a Poston pilgrimage. And I nagged him, nagged him and nagged him. And, he finally gave in, so to speak. But when I finally got to Tule Lake the first time in the early 70s, and then even on the pilgrimages, it always made me cry. Now, this is, I'm a Sansei, I don't know anything. I've had a happy life, but it's just the power of the place just grabs you. And you start to look around and you see the conditions. For example, with the Manzanar pilgrimage, it's either hot, dusty, cold. I mean, they had to live like this every day. So Tule Lake temperature today is 20 low and I think 40 high today. And so to be not prepared and sent to this place, your mind goes back to that time. So, I'm a pretty stoic person overall. My friends who are watching are probably kind of stunned that I'm so emotional. But, it hurts me to see what happened to all these people. And this is what gives me the strength to do this. Because although I have not been harmed personally, I do bear the trauma in a very, like secondhand smoke just way, way, way down the road. But I feel that it's a terrible wrong. And so I have to try to fight this.
I would urge everybody that's interested to attend a pilgrimage, especially the Tule Lake one. It's really a great pilgrimage, very well organized. I've been to the Manzanar 3 times, and I've been to the Tule Lake one 3 times. So it's very well organized, and I really recommend that people go to really learn about what happened. And what I'm really surprised is that in the last 2 pilgrimages, when we had opening night, and people, they were asked to raise your hand if this was your first time, I would swear in the 2018 one, 80% of the people raised their hands. So, being that the first time you go, you will not be the only one. There are many of you. So, frankly, that makes me very, very happy that people would go to learn about what happened.
We received several comments from people on the Tule Lake Pilgrimage Committee saying this will not be an in-person. One from Conrad says, still worth participating. So yes, it will be a virtual pilgrimage and please participate. Just one fact is Manzanar had its first community pilgrimage in 1969, its first pilgrimage in 1946, led by Reverend Nagatomi. And then Tule Lake was the second pilgrimage, early mid-70s and Poston as well. So Tule Lake's first pilgrimage, I believe, was 1977. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And Edison Uno was very instrumental in both Manzanar and Tule Lake pilgrimages. So that's an important fact. We have a couple more questions. Carrie Kabbalah asks, do you have plans on the future use of the book, either as a textbook or other resource for schools, and will it be published in paperback?
The book is beautiful and heavy to carry in your backpack. So my designers are the same designers for Tuna Canyon, and this was their vision. So I hope we can make it more accessible. The Suyama online is very accessible, but Karen Omemoto said I should do an ebook. Not today, but very soon. But I think you don't get to see the pictures of my sister's artwork, which I think is very compelling. Because for someone to carry the images that she produced for 70 years before she was able to let them go, so to speak, is incredibly tragic, that her life was so traumatized. And she made the Tule Lake Guard Tower from memory. These are things that she just did from memory as a 4-year-old. So I think I answered your question. I may have missed did I miss something, Bruce?
No, she wanted to know if it would be published in paperback.
We'll see.
Diane asks, how do we join the pilgrimage when COVID is over? For Tule Lake, you can just Google Tule Lake Pilgrimage. It's tulelake.org, and they'll have information on their website.
Nancy, can I add on to that?
Yeah, please.
Tule Lake the pilgrimage is so popular. Usually they make an announcement in February, and within a week it is booked. Because it is all volunteer, they can only take a limited amount of people. And I think they only limit it to 400 people. And so once that limit is reached, they close it and you will be put on a waiting list. So look for an announcement, usually in February. And one more thing, Bruce, I think the first Tule Lake pilgrimage also was in 1969.
Thank you, Martha. Conrad is asking that we mention the fight over the land, preserving the land at Tule Lake, and public action needed. So if you could log on to tulelake.org, and you can find out about the fight the Tule Lake Committee is having to preserve the land and particularly the airstrip there. So by all means, log on to that website. There are a few comments that I would like to read. There's a huge thank you from David Fujioka to all 5 of today's panelists for helping keeping the Issei and Nisei stories relevant for current and future generations. And let's see, Carrie Morita says, thank you. On a visit to Tuna Canyon is when I found out my grandfather was initially sent to Tuna Canyon, then to Lordsburg, and finally joined the family at Santa Fe. So you see the parallels there. She also asks, or else states, that she would love to see a reading done of the diary. Maybe we could get Grateful Crane to do one of their famous, powerful plays and readings. Are there any other questions people would like to ask? We covered a lot of ground, that's for sure. Kensaku Nakayama asks, will transcripts of this program be made available? There's a lot of great historical context in the panelists' presentations. And we are recording this, and we will make it available in the Manzanar Committee YouTube channel. And you can access that through our website. Just Google Manzanar Committee. And also, I'm sure Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute also will make this available. The book is also available, so please, if you have not purchased a copy, by all means, through either site or at Janum. I believe Janum Bookstore carries it. So by all means, try and get a copy of this really invaluable book. Are there any comments or questions that the panelists would like to make before we move on?
I'd like to thank you, Bruce, for hosting this along with the Japanese Cultural Institute, because I know you're very busy and you always ask a busy person, right, to help you. And they step up and it's deeply appreciated. Did a magnificent job. And I want to thank all our partners here today, which represent the descendants and on different generations, because that was the visual image I wanted to create, that this is an important story that has affected many generations of us. And, it's interesting. I did pick judo as my focus. And so I do want you all to know that there will be another presentation in March at the San Fernando Valley Japanese Community Center, probably going to be virtual as well. And Soji Kashiwagi will be part of that program, as well as JP de Guzman. But the idea was to use different lenses as we look at this story. The first one was the scholars, and then this time we have our one scholar, which is Martha, and then us on the ground people. And then the third one, I always bring in a scholar because they keep us out of trouble. And she knows the dates, and JP will know the dates. So that's very important as we tell a story, that we're accurate. So I do want to thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your leadership with the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. That's one of our most amazing community committees, I think, and you were the backbone and driving force behind that. And I see clearly after reading your father's diary where that comes from. You have very good roots there. Martha, is there something you would like to add before we wrap up?
No, but I really want to thank you, Bruce, and everybody else for this panel discussion. And hopefully we can continue the conversation.
Yes, so the other two, there's two more of these community conversations coming up, as Nancy mentioned, that the San Fernando one is March 26th. Please let your friends know. And by all means, you got to watch a good movie twice just to remember all those scenes. So I think it's important. This is my second one. I went to the Janum one as well. And I'm sure I'm going to be seeing the other two. And then there's one in San Jose. So please stay tuned. Log on to those websites that we mentioned. Check out the work. Go on a pilgrimage. As Nancy said, Kyoko said, the power of place is something you have to experience directly. So thank you all for attending today. And thank you, Kyoko, for being such an inspiration and bringing harmony to our work. So thank you.
I'd like to say, together we are stronger.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.